Everybody else ready? Sweet. My time starts now. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Because we agree with Sun Tzu, we proudly affirm the resolution that on balance, diplomacy has better maintained peace than military power for three main reasons. First, diplomacy maintains better relations than military power, which maintains better peace. Second, military power does not always solve the issue. And third, diplomacy can resolve conflicts without losing lives, and it preserves the economy. Contention 1. Diplomacy maintains better relations than military power, which maintains better peace. The best way to create long-lasting peace is to have good relations, and the only way that can resolve conflict and retain good relations is diplomacy. The UN has maintained peace for 70 years because of diplomacy and sanctions. And during World War II, Japan and the US both had heavy casualties, with Japan having 2 cities nuked and the US losing one of their biggest military bases ever. However, diplomacy helped the U.S. attain a now dependable ally, and now together they can work on solving other conflicts, such as the North Korean missile crisis. In addition, millions of lives are lost in war. According to the New York Times, 108 million people have died in wars. In fact, post-war conflicts can arise and create more malice between countries. After the Vietnam War and the Gulf War, there were over 63 conflicts. Post-war conflicts. Contention 2. Military power does not always solve the issue. The goal of military power is to defeat or intimidate the opposing force to make them agree with a compromise. However, military power gambles that our opposition will be intimidated into compromising and that we will win through sacrifice of lives and money. This is both dangerous and ineffective. In fact, during the Second Iraq War, the U.S. tried using military force to get rid of the dictator and liberate the Iraqi people. Instead, it threw Iraq into a civil war. There are also countries from the Middle East that fought in 5 wars, and all 5 wars failed to resolve anything, with the predominantly Muslim countries and Israel fighting over disputed land with heavy casualties. Yet the casualties of war do not only include the loss of life, and in addition, there is also PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Those Soldiers fighting the battle suffer from PTSD after facing war, and we cannot allow our soldiers to die and face this traumatic disorder. In contention 3, diplomacy can resolve conflicts without losing lives and preserves the economy. When asked to provide a solution to a conflict, most will try to provide one that loses the least lives. That's because they understand that lives can't be gambled. That solution is diplomacy. The Cold War was resolved without losing lives, while World War II lost many lives. The Cold War was prevented through coercive diplomacy, and while in World War II, through military power, we lost millions of lives trying to stop Hitler from taking over Europe. Recently, there was also a standoff at India's border with China. However, no shots were fired, and today China and India are still within peace. In fact, what happened was China tried to build a road near India's border, and through diplomacy, China and India resolved the issue such that not a single shot has been fired. Diplomacy is also more cost efficient than military power. For every military C-17 cargo plane, we can hire 1,100 diplomats. This means if diplomacy is much more effective than military power, and is a lot more cost efficient and saves the lives of the American people, I see no reason why we should use military power. So because of these 3 reasons, that diplomacy maintains better relations than military power, which maintains better peace. Military power does not always solve the issue, and diplomacy can resolve conflicts without losing lives and preserves the economy. I urge a pro ballot. Thank you.
Time will start now. So in your case, you described how the UN had preserved peace for 70 years, correct?
Yes.
So who makes decisions in the UN?
All countries, it's a representative system where all countries have a say in the UN.
Actually, that's incorrect. So there's something called the Security Council.
Yeah, the UN Security Council is there in case there's a bad decision that is made, and they can veto those decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
But all countries have equal say in there, and thus through diplomacy, because of negotiations, because every single country had a say together, and because they all agreed on something, the UN has maintained diplomacy for 70 years.
Okay,
yes.
so first of all, so you agreed that the Security Council can veto any decision. So therefore, the Security Council has high impacts in any decision that's being made. And then even then, who is on the Security Council? Can you tell me?
I believe it would be the U.S., China, Russia, and basically, I think maybe England would be on there, but basically world powers.
And why are they world powers?
Because, what? Because they're through technology, through the development of nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons, so their power is because of military power. And then moving on to another question, you talk about coercive diplomacy, correct?
Mhm.
So coercive diplomacy is, can you define that term for me?
Yeah, no problem. Coercive diplomacy is the diplomacy of threats. Rather than relying on negotiation, diplomats will sometimes threaten adverse consequences if a demand is not met. Sometimes, and this is according to the University of Colorado.
Okay, so it's using threats, but you cannot threaten if you don't have a military power to threaten with. How are you supposed to use coercive diplomacy if you don't have military power?
You don't have to agree with their demands.
What do you mean? So you're saying making a threat, right? That's diplomacy.
Yes?
But you can't make a threat if you have no power to make the threat with. So don't you need military power to enforce that threat? Or to make sure that countries listen to that threat?
I'd say maybe in some cases, but I don't think, for example, in cases such as okay, thank you.
No. Hello, I'm Dan Choi, and we're speaking on the con side of this debate resolved. On balance, diplomacy has better maintained peace than military power. We define military power as the resources that a nation can mobilize against other nations for the purposes of military deterrence, defense, and war. We note that even if we cannot prove that military power provides more solvency than diplomacy, we still win if we prove that diplomacy depends on military power. Condition 1. Military power is a precedent to diplomacy. It was the threat of military force, ironically, that got to the chemical weapons agreement, says James Jeffrey, senior ambassador to Iraq. That is how the world works. You cannot separate diplomacy from military force. Harris 2016 corroborates this, saying that a well-appointed military improves diplomacy with adversaries, strengthens our alliances, signals credibility and resolve, deters aggression, and enhances national morale. Furthermore, Napoleon, Frederick the Great, and Earl Grey all credit that diplomacy without force is like an orchestra without instruments. All these sources point to one fundamental idea, that military power is a precedent of diplomacy. Military power is the base that allows diplomacy to work in the first place. Therefore, without us, their positive impacts of diplomacy don't exist. The U.S. has had successful diplomacies only because of its great military power and global influence. This overpowering presence gives the other nations a reason to come to the table, while just diplomacy gives no reason or incentive at all. Look to Jeffrey again, who cites the example of President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. I saw them do major groundbreaking diplomatic initiatives that were revolutionary, but those guys were deploying military forces as an integral part of their diplomacy. That is why they were successful in their diplomacy, because of that military power. With a strong military backing up diplomatic policies, a nation capable of reacting conventionally or even threatening to do so, while at the same time prepared to defend and counter unilateral actions of misadventure, the government will be in a position to stick to its foreign policy of seeking dialogue from a position of strength. It will not need to oscillate from one approach to another every time there is a terrorist strike. In the world we inhabit today, the only global influences are the nations with the strongest military power, including U.S., China, and Russia. Contention 2, economy. Military power benefits the economy. There are multiple pathways by which investments in military hard power produce economic benefits. The world economy is deeply engraved and dependent of each other. We need access to markets, and in order for these markets to be accessible, we need a strong military that will intervene if necessary in order to keep these markets secured. The Middle East was and currently is often ruled by a dictator. With a lack of check and balances to control the dictator, they can do whatever they want with little to no opposition. Diplomacy wouldn't have stopped Iraq from invading Kuwait in 1990. Military intervention was necessary to protect our allies in Kuwait. If we did not intervene, Saddam would have set a trigger which would lead to severe damage on the world economy, a weakened U.S. position in the world stage, etc. Dictators need to be controlled. Military intervention will help control them. Dictators will not just comply with just diplomacy. Therefore, I urge a calm down. So I believe you have the first question.
Yes. Okay. So is everybody ready? Okay. I'll begin my cross-ex now. So I have a question for you. So you said that military power comes before diplomacy. Diplomacy is not effective unless through military power, correct?
Yes.
So may I ask you another question? What happens after military power?
After military power, we suppress other nations from trying to act aggressively and therefore cause peace and prevent conflict.
Okay. So, but then wouldn't we still be always at war the whole time if it was just through military conflict?
That's not true, because as long as we have strong military power,
No,
we're
okay,
able
let me rephrase my
control.
question. How do you end a war? Because we clearly don't want war. We clearly don't want both sides to keep continually sacrificing lives. I'm sure you'll agree that through military power, what you want to do is resolve a conflict, correct? So this war needs to end, correct?
Well, military power will provide solvency to resolve
Oh,
the
so you're-
war
so you're-
because, can I finish?
Yeah, no problem.
Because the military power will allow global influence, and this influence allows more peace-making ideas to be done.
Okay, I believe what happens after a military conflict is a treaty, which is a form of diplomacy, so diplomacy...
Actually, that's not true.
Okay, let me go on.
Our point
My
is...
question, I believe this
Can
is
I
my
finish?
crossfire. You can address that in your rebuttal speech. Okay. Next, I'd like to ask you another question. You said that military power you can gain overpowering influence to make others come to the negotiating table, correct?
Yes.
If a country doesn't feel safe, why would they come to the negotiating table?
Well, actually, they would feel safe because under the protection of a strong military power, if they try, then that gives them a reason to comply with them. As long as they're strong.
Comply? Like if they can't compromise,
Of course you wouldn't try
If they don't have
to
compromise anything, and if they don't have to lose anything, why would they want to come to the
It's
negotiating
inherent
table?
that you wouldn't try to come to get, you wouldn't want to oppose a strong force. And they want to protect themselves, and this can be done by
so you don't want to
getting
oppose
under
a strong force. So if the strong force is going to attack you, would you feel safe coming to the negotiating table with them to negotiate trade deals with them?
It won't attack.
Our time starts in 3, 2, 1, go. Hello, my name is Drew Pye, and I'll be doing the attack speech for the con side of this debate. So let's start by going down the case. So they started out by saying that we want to look for better relations, and we want to subdue the enemy without fighting. So essentially, for better relations, you need a safety net before you can come and even start negotiating, and that's what military power is. And second, subduing enemy without conflict actually weighs onto our side, simply because we have a deterrence effect that leads to people not wanting to fight, and so therefore they won't even be fighting under our side. So they started out by saying that the UN maintained peace for 70 years. So first of all, we already said that this is ruled by a council of the major powers that are appointed by their hard power. So the UN is actually governed by hard power. And second of all, and their only response was that it's a democratic thing with all the nations. And even if they win this point, the UN hasn't done anything in the past. In the past years, they claim peace, but look, it hasn't solved terrorism, it hasn't solved Iraq, it hasn't solved Afghanistan, it really hasn't done anything so far. And then they also talked about U.S. diplomacy helped get an ally in Japan after Pearl Harbor bombing, but the only reason this happened is because of the U.S. military power and the fact that Japan did not want to fight with the U.S. And this is the only reason why we had a diplomatic tie. Without military power, there would never have been any relations whatsoever. And they went on to talk about military power and the intimidation. So first of all, this only strengthens our deterrence effect. Because if they're really feeling that intimidated, then they won't attack. So exactly, there will not be conflict under our world. And then furthermore, they talked about sacrifice of lives, but we actually weigh this onto their side simply because if you look to the Versailles Treaty after World War I, it actually led to further conflict in World War II, proving that diplomacy, and especially failed diplomacy, which is can lead to a loss of lives. And then so they also talked about Iraq fighting battles, but notice that when diplomacy was attempted, it was simply infeasible because of regional tensions, and military intervention was necessary after the conflict. And then they also went on to talk about Cold War resolved, but that's just another example of how deterrence worked. It stopped the conflict. And then they finally talked about coercive diplomacy, but this is on our side, because coercive diplomacy is about making threats. And if coercive diplomacy does work, then you need something to back the threat up. If the threat is fake, no one is going to believe in it. So that's why you need military power for coercive diplomacy to even exist. And then they also said that Hitler failed, but notice that this was because of military power. And then they also went on to talk about India and China, but the reason was, so China would easily have taken the land away from India if it wasn't for the fact that the U.S. is backing up India with its military presence. And then, so they also talked about it's cheaper, but we already proved that diplomacy doesn't work, as in the Versailles Treaty. And so therefore, when it comes down to solvency, I strongly urge a con ballot. Thank you for your time. Okay.
Unless you want to tell me anything. I'm good. All right.
Ready? Let's go.
All right, just time start. Okay. Yep. So do you have any other examples in which diplomacy failed besides the treaty? of Versailles?
Kellogg-Briand Treaty, actually.
Do you have more than like 4 examples?
I can provide that to you in a later speech. I don't think we should waste crossfire time on that.
Okay. In addition, you said that. Are you aware there are more forms of diplomacy than diplomacy backed by hard power? So like trade and
Wait, you mean sanctions?
No, not sanctions, but increasing trade with other
Well,
countries.
first
That's
of
a form
all,
of diplomacy.
If people don't feel safe, then they're not going to trade, and the only way they're going to feel safe is if you have military power as a safety net.
Well, if you have if another country has military power, why would they feel safe trading with them?
No. See, okay, so essentially, if there's a country that you're unfamiliar with, if both sides have a military power safety net to fall back on, if either of the sides betrays the other, then there's still safety because of the military power safety net.
Diplomacy, the diplomacy of threats.
Wait.
That's literally definition of coercive diplomacy. So if one country gets attacked, then that country can attack back, which is basically like low-key a threat. Which is defined as coercive diplomacy, right?
Wait, but we've already won on coercive diplomacy, so if you're
How
thinking
have you won on coercive
we just
diplomacy?
proved it's on our side, because you can't have coercive diplomacy without military power.
But diplomacy in the end solves the issue, right?
No, I disagree.
No, diplomacy in the end solves the issue. Because without diplomacy, the threat of 2 countries wouldn't attack each other.
Wait. So first of all, without diplomacy, there would still exist conflict. It's not like diplomacy magically erases conflict simply because...
But hard power increases conflict because of war.
How?
Right? In wars, people
Deterrence.
die, right? In wars, people die. Right?
Yes, but war exists under both
But no,
sides.
answer my question. In wars, people die.
Yes,
correct?
I agree.
So wouldn't that increase conflict?
No, you failed to provide a link because we've said that there would be war under your side when your diplomacy fails.
But you've only provided 2 examples of this. How am I supposed to
I
believe
just
you?
said I'd provide more in my speech, and furthermore, we also talked about deterrence value, that there isn't going to be war under our side.
Which is coercive diplomacy.
No, deterrence is different from coercive diplomacy.
Yes, so opponents ready?
Yes.
Partner ready? Yep. Guys ready? Alright, my time starts now. My opponent's main basis of this, the main question of this debate is whether or not diplomacy is effective backed by military power. And the answer to this is no. The use of force, according to Harvard, the use of force would jeopardize many countries' economic objectives. So many countries don't even want to use hard power in the first place, and it's merely just there. In addition, countries can have soft power without the use of hard power. Take New Zealand. New Zealand is a small country, but in the UN, it still has a major role, and it still is pushing and it still has a major voice. In fact, New Zealand is pushing for a ban of nuclear weapons, and in the UN, it has a major role. In addition, my opponents have stated that the UN Security Council is composed of major world powers, but it's also composed of countries that have great technological and scientific things, but are still relatively neutral, such as Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, other countries such as those, or basically countries that are relevant to the world right now. So it's not really composed about military power, but it's composed of countries who are involved in major conflicts right now. In addition, even though if it was composed of countries who had major powers and who had military power, that still wouldn't deny the fact that it had many peace issues, that it resolved many conflicts and many issues. In fact, according to the UN has maintained overall peace over 70 years and is combating on terrorism. In fact, ever since 2014, the number of lives lost to terrorism has decreased over the years. In addition, there are other types of diplomacy besides actual diplomacy, which is negotiations and treaties. For example, there's trade and economic diplomacy. This diplomacy strengthens the bond between 2 countries, and as we talked about it in our third contention, it literally has no reliance on military power. In addition, they said that failed diplomacy leads to a loss of lives, but doesn't war lead to lives? In fact, 108 million people have died because of wars. And this outweighs all of this argument outweighs all of their arguments because we're talking about lives here. And lives matter way more than anything they've said so far.
In addition, PTSD is a disease that 8% of the American population suffers from, which also outweighs all of their claims. And for these reasons, I urge a con ballot.
Oh, cross. No.
That's fine. It's con.
Yeah. So, how do I restart?
Here.
Just one sec. Just getting the timer ready.
Crossword? 3 minutes. 2 minutes?
Okay. So, we can begin now. So you talked about how the impact of war, that 108 million lives were lost because of war.
Yeah.
How do you connect to war? Your side.
What do you mean?
How does your side help with war?
We help make sure that war doesn't happen. Because
Like
of
how?
diplomacy. Well, if you're negotiating and trying to avoid war, then obviously war is not happening.
But
We're trying to
diplomacy
make
has
the
failed
end of
multiple
war.
times before, as we said, and also
You've
like
only provided 2 examples.
we can provide a lot more.
Can
As
we provide them right now?
the Four-Power Treaty in 1921, the Good Neighbor Policy, the policy of appeasement, which actually led to Hitler becoming a lot more
Okay,
powerful,
but-
and there's a lot more. And this just shows how diplomacy failed in
But
history.
can't hard power also fail? As we
Hard power doesn't fail. We have clearly shown that it shows
Well-
deterrence. You completely ignored our point
Well,
on
in a-
deterrence, and we actually link to war
Excuse me,
better
can I
than you
speak?
because
Can I
we
answer your
prove
question?
deterrence.
Okay, so, well, actually, in our second convention, we literally stated that war has failed to resolve issues. For example, the U.S. tried to
Wait,
use
war?
military force in Iraq and liberate the Iraqi people. However, this caused chaos and more people died, more than any of the examples that you provided. Because
What do you mean more?
ultimately causes
We've shown you
more
how the
lives
policy
lost.
of appeasement failed, leading to Hitler becoming almost unstoppable. This led to World War II, the entire World War II. This means millions of people dead. That completely outweighs your example. And also, you also talked about
Wait, so
how
how did the
does Switzerland and Denmark have a presence? Like, I mean, how does Switzerland and Denmark
According
affect?
to the UN and themselves, they are on the UN Security Council.
But that doesn't matter because
But you said
we're
the
trying to
only reason
state
why
that UN is only successful because it has US, Russia, and China. Because it has those big
But
military
you
powers.
said you contradicted yourself. You said the UN wasn't successful, but we said it was. But
We're
still.
saying even if it was successful, you're wrong.
So my defense speech begins now. So they said the UN is governed by hard power. However, I would like to disagree that those countries, those world powers they say on the Security Council are there because they're the most respected and people respect them enough so that they can veto stuff. And they also said the UN doesn't do anything, but clearly the UN would be doing something. Otherwise, it'd dissolve like the League of Nations. It's a system where all the countries have an equal voice, and thus it's prevented many conflicts. And they also said the only reason the partnership between Japan and the U.S. has happened is because of military conflict. But no, I'd like to point out that this is in fact incorrect. Japan and the U.S. realized that military force did not resolve anything after World War II. Despite nuking 2 cities, the U.S. Still realized that military force was not a good way to maintain better relations. So through reform and diplomacy, thus the U.S. gained this valuable trade partner that helped to resolve even more conflicts. Also, the Vatican did not lose its soft power when it lost the Papal States in Italy. A lot of soft power isn't from government, according to Joseph Nye from Harvard. And I also like to point out that they said there are many failures of diplomacy, especially the Treaty of Versailles. But I like to point out that Versailles is a result of hard power through World War I, and right after that there was World War II. And it was all because military power wasn't powerful enough to resolve the first conflict, so it screwed up again and caused a second conflict. And so basically, what my opponents are saying is that we should stop prevent conflicts by creating more conflicts. Military power basically creates more conflict, creates more wars where people lose lives. As we talked about PTSD, these not only lives but many soldiers are injured and traumatically affected. And in fact, we have many examples that of this. After the Second Iraq War, as I said in my contentions, military force caused the rise of many terrorist groups and threw Iraq into a civil war. I'd like to point out that this is a result of military power. So through military power, this is the reason why we have the key issue of ISIS and all those other terrorist groups. And so because of this, because of all this problem that military power has created, and because that the diplomacy is clearly resolving the issue better than the military power. In fact, it's covering the screw-ups by military power. I'd like to point out that military power, diplomacy is in fact the best option. Thank you.
Okay,
One.
so
Now, first, my opponent talked about how military power jeopardizes peace. However, this is not true. The only way to negotiate is with military power. They mentioned coercive diplomacy. However, that's on our side because we've already clearly expressed that diplomacy is only because and a result of good military power. Also, we need military power because it's a safety net. If any conflicts arise, we need to have military power to prevent lives lost, outweighing their points and examples. Also, we need to use it as a bargaining chip. Using military power as a bargaining chip can improve negotiations and all that. And this is not on their side because we're talking that without military power, their impacts do not exist. We're not using diplomacy, but without us, they don't have their good effects. They also talked about we don't have examples. However, we already shown 5 examples about how diplomacy has failed, including one that led to the entire start of World War II, causing millions of people to die. They also talked about New Zealand. However, New Zealand also has a huge military, and that military strength also shows that it's on our side. And also, we've shown you that UN hasn't resolved any issues, and also the UN actually has U.S., Russia, and China. This itself, U.S., Russia, and China's presence itself in the UN causes the diplomacy to be successful if it was successful. And they also talk about ISIS and terrorism. However, ISIS and terrorism are being solved because of military power. And diplomacy is showing no solvency to do anything with this matter at all. And they also talked about trade. However, we outweigh on this because we've shown you that the military power is a safety net and prevents millions and severe damage to the global economy. Therefore, I urge a combat.
Opponents ready?
yes.
Partner ready?
Yep.
Judge ready? Right, and my time starts now. Judge, we are winning this debate because we have outweighed our opponents on all issues. For example, the major clash in this debate was basically if military power basically it was the only reason why diplomacy worked. But we win this because it's not, and we prove this in our rebuttal. The use of force would jeopardize countries' economic activity, according to Joseph Nye from Harvard University. So countries are less likely to use military power to back up their demands. In addition, they consider it morally wrong, and also it does not apply in all cases. For example, the Vatican did not lose its soft power when it lost the Papal States of Italy, so basically it's a major source of hard power. And in addition, a lot of soft power isn't from the government; it's from trade. And without diplomacy to resolve relationships between the U.S. and Japan, we wouldn't even be trading with Japan, and our industry would go down, and people would lose their jobs. In addition, the UN has maintained peace for over 70 years, and the only reason why while those countries are on the Security Council is because they're most respected and their matters are most relevant to what it is today. That's the only reason why they are on the Security Council, not because of hard power. In addition, war causes people to die, and every second diplomacy is used is a second of peace, and it's a second that a soldier doesn't have to say goodbye to his family or to his mother, never to return again. In addition, they said that hard power is like a safety net to catch countries if diplomacy doesn't work, but hard power essentially means war, which causes people to die. And also, we get their terrorism contention because according to Homeland Security and NATO, as we mentioned before, soft power plays a major role in terrorism, and Homeland Security say the way that fight terrorism is defensive, and they work together with other countries to defeat terrorists. So all in all, without diplomacy, we wouldn't be able to fight terrorists, and we save more lives. And for these reasons, I urge a pro ballot.
Okay, so remaining prep time.
You have 1:31.
My time starts in 3, 2, 1, go. So once again, I will be doing the summarizing and weighing of the concept of this debate. So first, we both agree that we should consider lives over all other impacts. So let's start by going over the main clashes. So the first clash is precedent and whether you need military power to back up diplomacy. And essentially their only response was that military power won't be used. But it's not the point that military power will be used. The fact that it can stay there as an effective deterrent and as an effective threat to back negotiations up is what is necessary. So this point effectively flows directly, and we gain all of their impacts on this point. And then moving on to deterrence. So they've not responded to this at all. It flows directly to the end of this debate. And we've proven that with military power, war won't happen simply because deterrence, cost of war, too high. So therefore, any of the impacts that they say about war in military power, that's not real. And then I went on to talk about the UN, which is one of the bigger clashes. So all they said was that they were respected. But why are they respected? It's because they have military power. Why else would they be respected? And plus, the fact that they say that terrorism is prominent means that the UN hasn't done anything. And then about terrorism, right? We see ISIS numbers going down. Why? Because military power is solving the conflict that diplomacy has failed to do. And moving on, we talk about the failure of diplomacy. They haven't responded to this either. We show that millions of lives were lost in World War II simply because of the failure of diplomacy in the Versailles Treaty after World War I. And then moving on, I talked about trade, but we rebutted this with safety net. You can't do any of their impacts without the essential safety net of military power. Otherwise, immediately no one is going to listen to you. Which brings us to the last point, bargaining chip. Military power can be used essentially. No one is going to listen to you if you don't have military power. So military power is a bargaining chip that can bring all their positive impacts to our side, like trade. And at this point, the debate might seem like peace versus war, but in reality, we're the side advocating for peace and they are war. Therefore, I strongly urge a con ballot. Thank you for your time.